There's a moment when everything breaks, when the woman you loved walks away without looking back, her silence cutting deeper than any words she could have spoken. When the career you built crumbles beneath your feet, years of sacrifice reduced to nothing more than a memory. When you stare into the mirror and see a stranger looking back, wondering how you became so weak, so reactive, so completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. In that moment, you realize something terrifying. You are not the master of your own mind. You are a slave to circumstance, a prisoner of your own emotions, drowning in a sea of suffering that seems to have no end. This is the modern condition. Men walking through life like ghosts, carrying invisible wounds that never heal. They smile during the day but lie awake at night, replaying every rejection, every failure, every moment when life revealed their powerlessness. They medicate with work, with alcohol, with endless distractions, but nothing stops the bleeding. Inside, they tell themselves, tomorrow will be different, that they'll be stronger. But tomorrow brings only new ways to suffer. They have forgotten something ancient, something that once made warriors out of ordinary men and philosophers out of slaves. In the ruins of ancient Rome, in the prison cells of enemies, in the quiet chambers where emperors contemplated mortality, there lived men who discovered a law so powerful it transformed suffering into strength, chaos into calm, and weakness into an unshakable foundation of inner peace. This law was not written in books of magic or hidden in temples of mystery. It was carved into the very essence of what it means to be human, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave enough to look within. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, commanding legions and ruling an empire, wrote these words in his private journal. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He understood what modern men have forgotten. The battlefield is not out there in the world of circumstances and other people's opinions. The battlefield is in here, in the space between what happens and how you choose to respond to what happens. This is where freedom lives or dies. But let me tell you about the man who learned this law by accident, was broken, destroyed by a betrayal so complete, it rewrote his understanding of trust itself. She had been his everything, his future, his reason for building the life he thought they would share. When she left, she took more than love with her. She took his sense of reality, his belief in goodness, his faith in tomorrow. He became a ghost, haunting his own existence, replaying their conversations, analyzing every sign he had missed, torturing himself with questions that had no answers. For months, he lived in this prison of his own making. He would wake up angry and go to sleep bitter. Every song reminded him of her. Every couple he saw reminded him of what he had lost. Every sunset reminded him of dreams that would never come true. He thought his suffering was about her absence. It's about the injustice of what had happened, about the unfairness of love itself. He thought he was the victim of circumstances beyond his control. Then came the night when everything changed. Sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by the debris of his former life, he found himself reading words written by a slave nearly 2,000 years ago. Epictetus, who had been beaten, chained, and sold his property, yet somehow discovered a freedom that no master could take away. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were new, but because they revealed a truth he had always known but never understood. His suffering was not caused by her leaving. Suffering was caused by his thoughts about her leaving, by the story he told himself about what it meant, and by his attachment to how things should have been, instead of accepting how things actually were. In that moment, he glimpsed the ancient law that would set him free. Nothing external has the power to disturb your peace, unless you give it permission through your own judgment. This revelation did not come easily. The mind fights against such truths because they threaten its favorite story, the story that someone else is responsible for your pain. But as days turned into weeks, he began to practice this ancient wisdom. When the wave of sadness crashed over him, instead of drowning in it, he observed it. Instead of identifying with the pain, he watched it arise and pass away, like weather in the sky of his consciousness. Instead of resisting what had already happened, he began to accept what was. The slave Epictetus had taught that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. This man began to see how true this was. The actual moment of her leaving had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. But he had relived it 1,000 times, each replay adding new layers of suffering, new interpretations, new ways to torture himself. He had been his own executioner, creating suffering where none needed to exist. Slowly, something shifted. The tightness in his chest began to loosen. The obsessive thoughts began to lose their grip. He still felt sad sometimes, still missed what had been, but he was no longer drowning in it. He had learned to separate what happened from his judgment about what happened. He had discovered the space between stimulus and response, and in that space, he found his power. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate associates you." This man began to understand that his resistance to reality had been the source of his torment. The relationship had ended. This was simply a fact, as neutral as the rain or the turning of seasons. His judgments about what this meant, his attachment to how things should have been, his refusal to accept what was, these were the true sources of his suffering. He began to see suffering everywhere, but now with different eyes. He saw men raging at traffic, as if their anger could change the positions of cars. He saw people devastated by criticism, as if someone else's opinion could diminish their worth. He saw friends paralyzed by fear of rejection, as if another person's response could determine their value as human beings. He saw the whole world enslaved to external circumstances, dancing like puppets to strings they didn't even know existed. But he also began to see something else, the possibility of freedom. Seneca had written, "You suffer more in imagination than in reality." This ancient Roman had understood that most human suffering is self-created, that we are not victims of circumstance but prisoners of our own thoughts. When you truly understand this, when you see through the illusion that external events control your inner state, something remarkable happens. You stop being afraid. Think about what you fear most: rejection, failure, loss, death, abandonment, humiliation. Now ask yourself, what if none of these things could actually hurt you? What if they could only hurt the image you have of yourself, the story you tell about who you're supposed to be, the expectations you've built about how life should unfold? What if the real you, the consciousness that observes all these experiences, remains untouched by whatever happens in the external world? This is not philosophical speculation. This is practical wisdom tested by centuries of human experience. The Stoics were not armchair philosophers, but men of action, soldiers and statesmen, who faced real hardships with this understanding. They knew that external events are like waves on the ocean. It's constantly changing, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, but always temporary. Your true self is like the depths of the ocean, unaffected by whatever storms may rage on the surface. As this man continued to practice this ancient law, he noticed other changes. He stopped seeking validation from others because he understood that their opinions were just thoughts in their minds, no more real or permanent than clouds in the sky. He stopped being controlled by anger because he realized that anger was his response to his own expectations being violated, not something imposed on him by others. He stopped being paralyzed by fear because he understood that fear was about imagined futures, not present realities. He became like still water, reflecting whatever appeared before him, but not disturbed by it. When someone criticized him, he listened to see if there was truth worth considering, but he didn't let their judgment define his worth. When opportunities arose, he pursued them without attachment to outcomes, knowing that his peace did not depend on success. When losses came, and they still came, he grieved but did not break. Understanding that everything in the external world is temporary, people began to notice the change in him. There was a calmness about him now, a centeredness that could not be shaken. He spoke less, but his words carried more weight. He reacted less, but his responses were more thoughtful. He seemed to have found something that most men spend their lives searching for: an unshakable foundation of inner peace that no external circumstance could disturb. Marcus Aurelius counseled, "Remember that very little disturbs the wise man." He laughs at the same things that make others cry. This man had learned to find humor in situations that once would have destroyed him, not because he had become callous, but because he had gained perspective. He could see the cosmic comedy in humans taking themselves so seriously. In the drama and urgency that people attach to temporary circumstances, the ancient law he had learned was simple, but profound. Your suffering is not caused by what happens to you, but by your resistance to what happens to you, by your attachment to how things should be different, by your identification with thoughts and emotions that arise and pass away like clouds in an empty sky. When you truly understand this, when you stop giving external events the power to control your inner state, you become free in a way that most people cannot imagine. But freedom is not the absence of challenges. If anything, life continued to present him with difficulties. People still disappointed him, plans still failed, losses still occurred. The difference was that these events no longer had the power to disturb his fundamental peace. He had learned what the Stoics called the discipline of desire, wanting what happens, rather than trying to make what you want happen. This is not passivity, but profound wisdom. The recognition that happiness comes from aligning yourself with reality, rather than demanding that reality align itself with you, Seneca wrote. Every new thing excites the mind, but a mind that seeks the truth turns from the new to the eternal. This man had found the eternal within himself, the part of consciousness that remains constant while everything else changes. He had discovered that he was not his thoughts, not his emotions, not his circumstances, but the awareness that observes all these things. And awareness itself cannot be hurt, cannot be diminished, cannot be destroyed by anything that happens in the world of form. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic. It was like watching a tree grow, hardly noticeable from day to day, but profound over time. Old patterns of reaction slowly gave way to new patterns of response. Where once he had been reactive, he became thoughtful. Where once he had been dependent on external validation, he became self-sufficient. Where once he had been at the mercy of his emotions, he became their master. He understood now what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote, "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it." He had spent years trying to change his circumstances, but the real power lay in changing his relationship to his circumstances. He had been trying to control the uncontrollable while ignoring the one thing he could actually control, his own mind, his own responses, his own judgments about what happened to him. This ancient law began to permeate every aspect of his life. In business, he pursued goals with full effort, but without attachment to outcomes, knowing that his worth was not determined by external success. In relationships, he loved fully but without possessiveness, understanding that trying to control another person was both impossible and unnecessary. In the face of criticism, he listened with openness, but did not let others' opinions determine his self-worth. In moments of loss, he grieved, but did not despair. Knowing that everything in the material world is temporary, the law had made him invulnerable, not because nothing bad ever happened to him, but because he had learned the difference between what happens and what it means. Events are neutral. Meaning is something we add through our interpretations, our expectations, our attachments. When you stop adding unnecessary meaning, when you stop taking everything personally, when you stop demanding that life conform to your preferences, you discover a peace that surpasses all understanding. Epictetus taught, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." This man had learned to choose his reactions consciously, rather than being swept away by automatic patterns of thought and emotion. I developed what the Stoics called prososche, a mindful attention to the present moment that allows you to see clearly rather than through the distorting lens of fear, desire, anger, or attachment. But perhaps the most profound change was that he stopped being afraid of his own emotions. Before learning this ancient law, he had feared sadness, avoided anger, and desperately sought happiness, as if it were something he could capture and keep. Now he understood that emotions are like weather, arising naturally and passing away in their own time. His job was not to control them, but to not be controlled by them, to experience them fully without being identified with them. He became like a mountain that experiences all seasons but is not defined by any of them. Winter does not make a mountain sad, spring does not make it joyful, summer does not make it proud, autumn does not make it depressed. The mountain simply is, allowing all weather to come and go, while remaining fundamentally unchanged. This is the freedom that comes from understanding the ancient law. You are the consciousness that experiences all states but is not limited by any of them. Years passed, and people sometimes asked him about his secret, sensing something different, about his presence, but unable to name it. He would tell them about the ancient law, about the wisdom of the Stoics, about the difference between what happens and our judgments about what happens. Some understood immediately, recognizing a truth they had always suspected. Others dismissed it as philosophy, preferring to remain victims of their circumstances rather than take responsibility for their inner lives. But for those who were ready, who had suffered enough to be open to a different way, he would share the words that had transformed his life. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He would explain that this power is not about positive thinking or denial of reality, but about the fundamental recognition that your peace does not depend on external conditions, that your worth is not determined by other people's opinions, that your happiness is not at the mercy of circumstances beyond your control. The ancient law is not a concept to be understood intellectually, but a practice to be lived daily. Every moment offers an opportunity to choose. Will you be disturbed by what happens? Or will you remain centered in the knowledge that you're true? Self is untouchable. Will you resist reality and create suffering? Or will you accept what is and find peace? Will you give others the power to control your emotional state? Or will you take responsibility for your own inner life? Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not as teachings for others, but as reminders for himself. Recognizing that wisdom is not something you achieve once, but something you must practice continuously. You can commit injustice by doing nothing, he reminded himself. And this applies to the injustice we commit against ourselves when we allow external circumstances to disturb our inner peace. Every time we react unconsciously, every time we let someone else's behavior determine our emotional state, every time we resist what has already happened, we are doing violence to our own well-being. The man who learned this ancient law became a different kind of warrior, fighting not against external enemies, but against the unconscious patterns that had once enslaved him. His weapons were not swords, but awareness, acceptance, the unshakable knowledge that nothing external could touch the essence of who he was. His victories were not over others, but over his own reactivity, his own attachments, his own unconscious identification with temporary phenomena. In quiet moments, he would reflect on how much energy he had wasted in his former life, how much suffering he had created unnecessarily, how much power he had given away to circumstances and other people. But he felt no regret, only gratitude for having discovered the truth that had set him free. He understood now why the Stoics spoke of philosophy not as an academic subject, but as a way of life, practical discipline for achieving the one thing that truly matters, an unshakable inner peace that no external force can disturb. The ancient law that had transformed him was available to anyone willing to practice it. Nothing external can harm you unless you give it permission through your own judgment. Your suffering comes not from what happens, but from your resistance to what happens, your attachment to how things should be different, your identification with thoughts and emotions that arise and pass away like waves on the ocean of consciousness. This is the freedom that awaits you, not the freedom to control external circumstances, which is impossible, but the freedom to choose your response to whatever circumstances arise. This is the strength that no one can take from you, not physical. Strength that diminishes with age, not circumstantial strength that depends on favorable conditions, but the strength that comes from knowing who you really are beneath all the roles you play and stories you tell about yourself. When you truly understand and practice this ancient law, you will no longer be at the mercy of other people's moods, opinions, or actions. You will no longer be disturbed by circumstances beyond your control. You will no longer suffer more in imagination than in reality. You will have discovered the one thing that can never be taken from you, the power to choose peace over conflict, acceptance over resistance, love over fear, wisdom over reactivity. This is your inheritance as a conscious human being. This is your birthright that no external authority can grant or revoke. This is the ancient law that once learned and practiced will ensure that nothing will hurt you again in the way things used to hurt you. Not because you will become invulnerable to all experience, but because you will have learned the difference between experiencing life fully and being enslaved by your experience of life. The gate to this freedom is always open. The ancient law is always available. The only question is whether you are ready to step through, to take responsibility for your inner life, to stop being a victim of circumstances and become the master of your own mind. The choice, as always, is yours.